But I do have a day job. I'm principal of Homerton College, University of Cambridge, and a deputy vice-chancellor of the university. This is Cambridge Arcana, all these titles. Up until 2 weeks ago, I was a vice-chancellor's deputy with a small d, and now I've been upgraded. I'm a deputy vice-chancellor.
Congratulations.
Thank you. You heard it first here. So there's all of that world, and it is a very, very absorbing world. As to what students think, I mean, they know that I write fiction. Some of them have heard me read it here in New York, and my book is in their college library and so on, so they know. I think it's good that they see someone who, at this relatively advanced stage of life, is trying something new and is quite serious about it. I think it should tell them that we go on learning and changing and evolving all our lives long. So if, just for that reason, I'm very happy with the situation. The situation is Cambridge, it's academic Cambridge, and as you said, I appear to be the first head of house to have written fantastic fiction since M.R. James. We have one thing in common, I think. I wouldn't say my writing is as good as James's, but I would say that he had an instinct, which may be quite British, to base fantasy in real everyday things to which something has happened, to warp them. So at the end of A Whistle and I'll Come to You, My Lad, which is a quite dark story, the phantom from the beyond homes in on the protagonist's victim and is described just in the moments before it ends in insanity and probably worse, as being, I think, something like a crumpled bedsheet. And there is something horrible about that, which comes from the very everyday nature. It's defamiliarizing the familiar, making the normal strange. And once you've thought your way into that, of course, any object in the room or any event can seem potentially menacing. The fact that there's a knock at the door, the fact that you can hear a voice, the fact that there are footsteps above you, those things are perfectly normal and everyday, but with just one little mental twist, they mean that the fire demon's here, and you don't want to meet him.
Which leads into the next question, which is some people see fantasy and horror as pulp fiction rather than art. What's your view of this?
Well, I love pulp fiction, so I'm quite okay with that, just as I love pop music and I love the movies, and I think all that's joyously part of the carnival of our lives. And if we just spent all our time reading only late Henry James or listening only to Chopin, then we'd be missing an awful lot. Having said that, there is an interesting aspect to all this, which is I don't know quite where a writer like Stephen King sits, and I think possibly the final interest in Stephen King and his work isn't to do with deciding whether it's literature with a capital L or pulp fiction, but rather seeing him as a lightning conductor for American anxieties and human anxieties generally, and worrying less about the style and more about what's working and what's powerful in that writing, or sometimes even more so in the film adaptations of the writing. As a writer, I find him rather, I have to say, unedited, but at the same time he can write very powerfully. Does it matter so much whether we call this literature or pulp fiction? It's interesting when it works, either way. So some of this work we're talking about, I think, sits on a curious cusp, and the traditional demarcations of literature as taught in universities and the dime store novel, aren't there really. You're in two worlds.
So you're a literary critic. Would you say Stephen King's writing is pulp fiction, or you kind of answered the question, but how would you describe it to your students?
I would say don't look for high style here because you're not going to get it. Don't worry about massive repetition because you will find it. There is sentimentality there. He often seems intent on saving the small town and the people in the small town from the alien than he is in the alien. I go more to the other extreme. I like horror films a lot, but the horror films I like the most are those where actually you feel drawn over to the midnight side of things, and even, strange as this might sound, would like to live in the film in some ways. One of my favourite horror films is John Carpenter's The Fog, 1980. And in my mind, I would love to be, I kind of am, that DJ at midnight playing jazz in a lighthouse, looking out, watching the fog roll into San Antonio Bay.
So within that context, what can fantasy bring to the reader's table that other mainstream genres may not?
It can encompass some of those other genres. I think fantasy can encompass romance. You're Not Dead does this. It encompasses crime, and the sequel novel is called Dream Crimes. It can encompass the Gothic. It even encompasses the campus novel. So fantasy is more elastic, and you can get things into that fantastic hold-all, whereas if you were solely writing romance or solely writing science fiction, I'm not sure that it would be so capacious in terms of what you could get in there. As I've said, it also means you can cut to the chase. You can provide a kind of thinking on your feet philosophy, a philosophy of lived instances of strangeness, and life is strange. That's what I want to get over. Fantasy is not an escape from reality. It's a penetration of reality in order to expose the strangeness, which we all know is there, which we have to calm and damp down in order to live our lives with some sort of semblance of order and not panic.
We focus for a moment on Inside You're Not Dead, which seems to be a good segue from what you've just said. Your main character is Miles Proctor. He's an academic turned psychic sleuth. You're an academic. Whether you are psychic, we don't know. Is Miles you?
I'm not going to say whether I'm psychic or not. Is Miles me? Yes and no. He certainly physically has some resemblance to the younger me. He has pepper and salt hair, and I started going grey when I was 19, probably because I read so much Poe and Lovecraft. But in some ways he will physically suddenly remind me, or is perhaps partly based on my older son. And sometimes he isn't anybody, he isn't me, he's nobody I've ever known. He's a page on which events write things, and he responds. There's something of the cipher about him, as I think there is often about the main character. The main character will not be, maybe shouldn't be, as sharply drawn as some of the very, very definite and distinctive minor characters, because this is the area that of the book that the reader's mind is going to accompany and engage with. So if it can be done in a hospitable way and let the reader in, if there's a certain lack of definable characteristics about the main character, that can be a good way forward for fiction, I think.
Do you ever think of him as an imaginary friend?
He is my imaginary friend. He is indeed.
I thought that might be the case. Why the name Miles, and then why the name Proctor?
Yeah. Miles, I'm a jazz buff. I'll fess up, I'm a jazz buff, and using Miles gave me a kind of running gag whereby I could insinuate the titles of Miles Davis tracks and albums into the fabric of the novel. So the final chapter is called In a Silent Way, as is one of his greatest recordings. And I can use words like milestones and phrases like miles ahead in a punning way. So that was helpful to me. And it's a name that I feel some affection for. Proctor, well, he's Anglo-Scottish. He's of Scottish descent, but to all intents and purposes English. But proctor means different things in English and Scots. In English, a proctor is a minor university functionary, which he is. But in Scots, a proctor is one who helps and guides people, which is what he will become during the novel. So all those names are to some degree significant. The only footnote to that I'd add was that he was originally going to be called Miles Corbyn. I like the name Corbyn, but there's a certain English politician with that name, and that, you know, the change at the leadership of the Labour Party made that name unusable. It is curious.
When you changed the name.
No, it is curious how. Or it's not curious at all, how things, events, politics, culture impinge, and suddenly you're not going in the direction you were going with. You've got to accommodate that change in the facts of our social situation.
Miles is on a quest for a very rare book, Transmutations. Can you tell us about that book and what it can do?
It is a very strange book. It claims to be able to make its reader an adept in the art of magic. And it's written deliberately in a rather flowery late 19th century prose. There are books from that period which have other books inside them. The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde alludes to strange books by French writers. I think he was thinking about Joris Cowell, Huysman and Baudelaire and so on. So there is a bit of a tradition of the magical book within the book. But I wasn't necessarily at all wanting to echo or perpetuate that. It's more the case that writing and any kind of fictional writing will become, at some point or points, a meditation on fiction. That circularity is just bound to happen. And this is my version of that. My book is a magic book. But all prose fiction will tend to think its way into meditation about literature and its purposes at some point.
Geoff, thank you.